Behind the carefully cultivated glamour of Hollywood's golden age lay a world of unbridled excess that would shock even modern audiences. While studio publicists worked overtime to maintain squeaky clean images for their stars, the reality behind closed doors told a vastly different story. These weren't just celebrities who occasionally strayed from societal norms. They were individuals who rewrote the rules entirely, living lives of such spectacular hedonism that their exploits became the stuff of legend. The same names that graced movie marquees and inspired millions were simultaneously engaged in behavior so scandalous that studios employed fixers whose sole job was to cover up their indiscretions. From secret affairs that could have destroyed careers to parties that lasted for days, from arrangements that defied conventional morality to appetites that knew no bounds, these Golden Age icons lived double lives that were as compelling as any role they played on screen. What makes their stories particularly fascinating is the stark contrast between their public personas and private realities. In an era when merely showing a married couple in the same bed on screen was taboo, these celebrities were pushing every conceivable boundary in their personal lives. The question isn't whether these stories are shocking, it's how the studios managed to keep such explosive secrets hidden for so long, and what finally brought these tales to light decades later. 1. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn wasn't just Hollywood's quintessential swashbuckler on screen. He lived with the same reckless abandon in his personal life, pursuing pleasure with an intensity that eventually became his defining characteristic off-camera. Born in Tasmania in 1909, Flynn arrived in Hollywood with chiseled good looks, natural athleticism, and an appetite for excess that would become legendary throughout the industry. His meteoric rise to fame with films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood made him one of the most bankable stars of the 1930s and 1940s, but it was his voracious pursuit of women, alcohol, and narcotics that truly set him apart from his contemporaries. Flynn's Mulholland Drive estate became infamous for parties that stretched across multiple days, featuring flowing champagne, pharmaceutical-grade substances, and a constantly rotating cast of starlets, extras, and hangers-on drawn to his magnetic personality and complete lack of inhibition. The actor installed a two-way mirror in one of his guest rooms, allegedly to observe guests in compromising positions, a detail that speaks to the voyeuristic tendencies characterizing much of his private behavior. His yacht, named Sirocco, served as a floating pleasure palace where Flynn entertained guests far from prying eyes, hosting gatherings that became the subject of whispered conversations throughout Hollywood. The most damaging scandal of Flynn's career erupted in 1942 when he was charged with statutory rape involving two teenage girls. The trial captivated the nation and threatened to destroy his career entirely. Though Flynn was ultimately acquitted, with his attorney successfully arguing reasonable doubt regarding the girls' ages and credibility, the proceedings revealed a pattern of predatory behavior specifically targeting young women. Testimony described parties where alcohol flowed freely to underage guests and where Flynn's interest in very young women was an open secret among his circle. The phrase "in like Flynn" entered the popular lexicon during this period, originally referring to his acquittal, but taking on a more salacious meaning related to sexual conquest. Despite the acquittal, Flynn's reputation never fully recovered, though paradoxically, some male fans seem to admire him even more for his unapologetic hedonism. His drinking escalated dramatically in the years following the trial, with vodka becoming his constant companion. By his own admission, he could consume 2 bottles of spirits daily without appearing obviously intoxicated, a tolerance built up through years of sustained abuse. This excessive drinking took a visible toll on his appearance. The handsome leading man of the 1930s became bloated and haggard by his 40s. Flynn's substance use extended well beyond alcohol. He experimented with morphine, cocaine, and various other narcotics, often mixing substances with dangerous disregard for his health. Friends and colleagues reported that Flynn seemed engaged in a form of slow-motion self-destruction, living as though he expected to burn out young and wanted to cram as much experience as possible into whatever time he had left. This prophecy proved self-fulfilling. Flynn died in 1959 at age 50, though his body was so ravaged by years of abuse that the examining doctor initially estimated his age as 75. 2. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin's artistic genius is unquestioned. He revolutionized cinema and created some of the most iconic images in film history. However, his personal life, particularly his pattern of relationships with extremely young women, reveals a darker side to the beloved filmmaker that became increasingly controversial as awareness grew about the power dynamics and age gaps involved in his romantic entanglements. Chaplin had a clearly established pattern of pursuing teenage girls, marrying several of them when they were minors, and he was decades older. His first wife, Mildred Harris, was 16 when they married. He was 29. The marriage was reportedly prompted by a pregnancy scare and ended badly within 2 years. Chaplin then became involved with Lita Gray, who was 12 when they met, and 15 when she became pregnant with his child. Chaplin, then 35, married her to avoid prosecution for statutory rape. This marriage was particularly troubled, ending in an acrimonious divorce that included a 50-page complaint detailing Chaplin's various extramarital affairs, sexual demands, and controlling behavior. After his second divorce, Chaplin became involved with actress Paulette Goddard, though the relationship was more age-appropriate. However, following their separation, Chaplin returned to his pattern of pursuing very young women. In 1942, he began an affair with aspiring actress Joan Barry, who was 30 years his junior. When Barry became pregnant and claimed Chaplin was the father, the ensuing paternity suit became a national sensation. Although blood tests proved Chaplin could not be the biological father, a scientific fact established with certainty, California law at the time did not allow blood test evidence in paternity cases, and Chaplin was ordered to pay child support. The scandal prompted FBI investigation into whether the actor had violated the Mann Act, which prohibited transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. Chaplin was indicted on this charge along with conspiracy charges, though he was eventually acquitted. The trials, however, damaged his reputation significantly, particularly as they highlighted his pattern of pursuing much younger women and his willingness to use his wealth and influence to facilitate these relationships. During the Barry trial proceedings, Chaplin married Una O'Neill, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill, who was 18 years old to his 54 years, a 36-year age gap. Unlike his previous marriages, this one proved lasting, and the couple remained together until Chaplin's death 34 years later, producing 8 children. Defenders point to the longevity of this final marriage as evidence that his motives were sincere, while critics note that pursuing an 18-year-old at age 54, particularly given his established pattern, reflects troubling attitudes about young women and power imbalances. Chaplin's preference for very young partners appeared to stem from multiple factors. He was reportedly drawn to what he perceived as innocence and malleability in younger women, preferring partners he could mold and control rather than independent women who might challenge him. This suggests a desire for relationships where he maintained clear power advantages using his age, wealth, fame, and industry influence to attract partners who would be unlikely to question his authority. 3. Mae West. Mae West carved out a unique space in Golden Age Hollywood by making sexuality central to her public persona at a time when such openness was virtually unprecedented for women. Born in 1893, West began her career in vaudeville before transitioning to Broadway, where her plays often courted controversy for their frank discussions of sex. When she arrived in Hollywood in her late 30s, West was already famous for pushing boundaries, and she had no intention of changing her approach for the more restrictive medium of film. West's personal life reflected the sexual liberation she portrayed on screen. She maintained relationships with multiple men simultaneously, including several who were significantly younger than herself, and spoke openly about physical pleasure in ways that scandalized contemporary society. Unlike many actresses who carefully guarded their private lives, West seemed to delight in the shock value of her candor. She made no secret of her belief that sexual attraction and satisfaction were natural, healthy parts of human experience, and she rejected the double standard that celebrated male promiscuity while condemning female sexuality. Her films, including She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, featured trademark innuendo-laden dialogue that somehow managed to slip past censors despite being quite explicit in meaning. Lines like, "Why don't you come up sometime and see me?" became cultural touchstones, delivered with a knowing smirk that left no doubt about the invitation being extended. West wrote much of her own material, ensuring that her characters were always in control of their sexuality rather than being objects of male desire. This was revolutionary. Her characters chose their partners, initiated encounters, and discarded lovers when they ceased to be interesting. Behind the scenes, West conducted affairs with boxers, actors, and her muscular bodyguards, whom she hired as much for their physical attributes as for their protective capabilities. She was particularly drawn to bodybuilders and athletes, appreciating the male form with an openness that reversed typical Hollywood dynamics. Industry gossip suggested that West's paramours needed to meet certain physical specifications, and that she was quite direct in her expectations regarding stamina and performance. West's sexuality extended into her later years in ways that defied conventional expectations for aging women. Well into her 60s and 70s, she continued to perform in productions that emphasized her sexual appeal, and she maintained relationships with men decades younger than herself. She underwent early plastic surgery procedures to maintain her appearance, and saw no reason to pretend that her interest in physical relationships had diminished with age. West was briefly jailed in 1927 for corrupting the morals of youth with her Broadway play Sex, which she had written, produced, and starred in. Rather than being chastened by the experience, she parlayed it into publicity, later claiming the time in jail was quite comfortable. The arrest only increased her fame and cemented her reputation as someone who refused to be silenced or shamed. Throughout her career, West maintained that her approach to sexuality was liberating rather than exploitative, arguing that embracing physical desire was healthier than the repression characterizing mainstream American culture. 4. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford built one of the most enduring careers in Hollywood history, reinventing herself multiple times to remain relevant across 4 decades of dramatic change. Behind her carefully maintained image as a professional and dedicated actress, however, Crawford lived a personal life marked by numerous affairs, complicated relationships, and behavior suggesting someone constantly seeking validation through sexual conquest and control. Crawford's romantic history includes marriages to Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Franchot Tone, Philip Terry, and Alfred Steele, but these legal unions represented only a fraction of her romantic entanglements. She conducted numerous affairs with leading men, studio executives, and industry figures, using relationships strategically to advance her career while simultaneously seeking emotional connection that seemed perpetually out of reach. Crawford was frank in her later years about having slept with several studio executives and producers early in her career, acknowledging that this was sometimes a conscious career calculation. What distinguished Crawford's behavior was the intensity and possessiveness she brought to her affairs. Multiple partners described her as sexually aggressive and demanding, expecting lovers to be available at her convenience while simultaneously maintaining relationships with other men. She reportedly kept detailed lists of her conquests and rated their performance, approaching sex with the same driven, competitive energy she brought to her career. Crawford's affair with Clark Gable became one of Hollywood's worst-kept secrets, continuing intermittently over many years, despite both parties being married to others at various times. The relationship seemed to represent something significant for Crawford. Gable was at the peak of his fame and masculinity, and being desired by him validated her status as a leading lady. However, the relationship was reportedly turbulent, with both parties engaging in jealous behavior and using their other affairs to provoke each other. The actress's relationships with younger men became more pronounced as she aged. She had well-documented affairs with men 20 or more years her junior, including relationships with actors who were barely starting their careers while she was an established star. Crawford seemed to prefer partners she could control and who were sufficiently impressed by her status to accept the terms she dictated. These younger lovers were often financially dependent on Crawford, who would provide them with money, clothes, and career opportunities in exchange for availability and discretion. There were persistent rumors throughout her career about relationships with women, including alleged affairs with several Hollywood actresses. While Crawford always publicly denied any same-sex relationships, multiple sources claim she maintained discreet liaisons with women throughout her life. If accurate, this suggests someone struggling with aspects of her identity in an era when any deviation from heterosexuality could destroy a career. Crawford's approach to relationships seemed to reflect deep insecurity, despite her outward confidence. She demanded constant reassurance from partners, required frequent declarations of love and devotion, and reacted badly to any perceived rejection or inattention. This neediness, combined with her controlling behavior, made lasting relationships difficult. The darker aspects of Crawford's personal life became public knowledge through Mommy Dearest, the memoir published by her adopted daughter Christina after Crawford's death, which revealed details about her romantic relationships, drinking, and behavior that painted a picture of someone whose private life was far messier than her public image suggested. 5. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead remains one of the most quotable and outrageous figures of her era, a theatrical and film actress whose frank sexuality and refusal to conform to social expectations made her both celebrated and notorious. Born into Alabama aristocracy, Bankhead had the confidence and financial security to behave exactly as she pleased, and she took full advantage of this freedom in ways that shocked even jaded Hollywood insiders. Bankhead's bisexuality was an open secret in entertainment circles. She conducted affairs with both men and women throughout her life, showing no particular preference for one over the other, and seeing no need to hide her orientation despite the serious professional and legal risks this posed. Her romantic relationships with women included several prominent actresses and society figures, and Bankhead spoke about these relationships with the same casual openness she brought to discussing her male lovers. Her list of male conquests reportedly included dozens of Hollywood's leading men, and Bankhead made no secret of her appetites. She was famous for propositioning people directly, sometimes within minutes of meeting them, with a bluntness that was either refreshing or appalling depending on one's perspective. Stories about Bankhead's sexual directness became legendary. She reportedly greeted new acquaintances with questions about their sexual preferences and availability, treating potential intimacy as a straightforward transaction rather than something requiring elaborate courtship. Bankhead's substance use was as unrestrained as her sexuality. She consumed alcohol in prodigious quantities, often starting her day with champagne and continuing to drink throughout the evening. She also used cocaine regularly, regarding it as a social amenity to be shared with friends and guests. Her parties at her New York townhouse became famous for their anything-goes atmosphere, with guests engaging in various combinations and configurations throughout the evening while Bankhead played host and occasional participant. The actress's language was notoriously profane, shocking even in private Hollywood circles where cursing was common. Bankhead seemed to delight in the reaction her vocabulary provoked, particularly among those who expected feminine propriety from a Southern lady. She weaponized her dirty mouth, using explicit sexual language to disarm, shock, or dominate conversations depending on her mood and objectives. Despite her outrageous behavior, Bankhead remained a star for decades. Her theatrical performances received critical acclaim, and she won a New York Film Critics Circle Award for her role in Lifeboat. Audiences seemed to appreciate that she was genuinely herself rather than playing a calculated image. Bankhead's openness about sexuality extended to her willingness to discuss topics that were strictly taboo in polite society. She spoke frankly about female pleasure, about her own experiences and preferences, and about the hypocrisy of a society that pretended women didn't have sexual desires while men were expected to. Her frankness on these topics was decades ahead of its time. The actress never married, though she had numerous proposals from both male and female admirers. She seemed to view marriage as an unnecessary constraint and preferred maintaining her independence and freedom to conduct relationships on her own terms. This choice was somewhat radical for a woman of her era, particularly one who made no secret of her active sex life. She died in 1968 at age 66, having lived entirely on her own terms without apology or regret, influencing subsequent generations of performers who found permission in her example to be more openly themselves. 6. John Barrymore. John Barrymore represented the tragic archetype of the supremely talented artist destroyed by his own excesses. Coming from the famous Barrymore theatrical dynasty, John was perhaps the most gifted performer of his generation, bringing classical training and natural magnetism to both stage and screen. However, his talent was matched only by his appetites, and his descent into alcoholism and sexual compulsion became one of Hollywood's most spectacular, cautionary tales. Barrymore's drinking was legendary even in an era and industry where alcohol consumption was ubiquitous. He could reportedly consume a bottle of whiskey during a typical evening and still perform brilliantly, though this supernatural tolerance gradually failed him as years of abuse accumulated. His alcoholism affected every aspect of his life, destroying marriages, damaging professional relationships, and ultimately making him unemployable, except in reduced circumstances that capitalized on his reputation as a has-been. His romantic life was equally excessive. Barrymore married 4 times and conducted numerous affairs between and during his marriages. He seemed to fall intensely in love at the beginning of relationships, pursuing women with poetry, grand gestures, and declarations of eternal devotion, only to become bored once the conquest was complete. This pattern repeated across decades, with Barrymore apparently unable to find lasting satisfaction in any relationship despite genuine emotional need for connection. The actor had a particular reputation for seducing his co-stars and was rumored to have slept with virtually every leading lady he worked with during his prime years. He approached these affairs with the same intensity he brought to his performances, making each woman feel uniquely special and desired before inevitably moving on to the next. This behavior reflected both enormous charisma and fundamental emptiness. Barrymore seemed to be constantly seeking something he could never quite find, whether in bottles or bedrooms. Friends and colleagues described interventions that Barrymore would enthusiastically embrace before quickly falling back into old patterns. He would swear off alcohol, commit to new relationships, promise to focus on his craft, and genuinely seem to mean these declarations in the moment. Within days or weeks, however, he would be back to drinking and womanizing, apparently unable to resist the siren call of temporary pleasure despite understanding intellectually that he was destroying himself. The decline was agonizing to watch. Barrymore went from playing Hamlet to tragic acclaim, to appearing in B-movies that exploited his reputation as a drunk, essentially playing himself in increasingly pathetic circumstances. His final years saw him performing in radio programs and minor film roles that traded on his name recognition while making his deterioration part of the entertainment. He died in 1942 at age 60, his body and mind destroyed by decades of abuse, leaving behind a legacy of what might have been had he been able to control his demons. 7. Lana Turner. Lana Turner's personal life was so dramatic that it sometimes overshadowed her considerable talent as an actress. Discovered while cutting class from Hollywood High School, Turner became one of MGM's top stars, but her romantic choices and the scandals that resulted often generated more headlines than her films. She married 7 times to 8 men. She married and divorced Stephen Crane twice, and conducted numerous affairs that kept gossip columnists busy throughout her career. Turner's taste in men was notably poor, with several of her husbands proving to be violent, controlling, or financially exploitative. Her marriage to Lex Barker, the actor who played Tarzan, ended after Turner's daughter, Cheryl Crane, revealed that Barker had been molesting her, a horrifying disclosure that Turner initially struggled to believe, despite evidence. The marriage to nightclub hypnotist Johnny Stompanato would end even more dramatically, with Crane killing Stompanato in 1958 in what was ruled justifiable homicide after he attacked Turner. The Stompanato killing became one of Hollywood's most sensational scandals. Stompanato had been physically abusive throughout their relationship, threatening Turner when she tried to end things and using his connections to organized crime to intimidate her. On the night of his death, he reportedly threatened to kill Turner, her mother, and her daughter, prompting 14-year-old Cheryl to grab a kitchen knife and stab him in defense of her mother. The inquest testimony revealed details of Turner's relationship with Stompanato, including his violence, her fear of him, and the increasingly dangerous situation that had developed. Beyond her marriages, Turner conducted affairs with numerous actors, directors, and industry figures. She had relationships with Frank Sinatra, Howard Hughes, Tyrone Power, and many others, often overlapping multiple affairs simultaneously. Turner seemed drawn to confident, often controlling men, repeating patterns even after previous relationships with similar personality types had ended disastrously. This suggests someone whose romantic choices were driven by psychological factors she couldn't quite overcome, despite understanding intellectually that she was making poor decisions. Turner's sexuality was a significant part of her screen image. She was marketed as a sex symbol, appearing in form-fitting sweaters that earned her the nickname the Sweater Girl, and playing roles that emphasized her physical attractiveness and romantic appeal. This public image sometimes made her private struggles with relationships seem ironic. Here was a woman who symbolized glamour and desirability to millions, yet who seemed unable to find stable, healthy romance in her own life. She died in 1995 at age 74, having lived a life of extraordinary drama that seemed fitting for someone whose on-screen roles so often involved romantic suffering and beautiful melodrama. 8. Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford occupied a unique position in Golden Age Hollywood as both a reasonably successful actor and a social connector whose ties to the Kennedy family made him a powerful facilitator for those seeking access to the corridors of power. His reputation as a playboy and party organizer made him a central figure in the intersection of Hollywood and politics, and his willingness to arrange introductions between starlets and powerful men implicated him in some of the era's most significant scandals. Lawford was a founding member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop, and this association cemented his status as one of Hollywood's premier hedonists. The Rat Pack's performances in Las Vegas were as famous for the after-parties as for the shows themselves, with Lawford serving as a combination performer, procurer, and fixer who ensured that whatever entertainment was desired could be arranged discreetly. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy, elevated Lawford's status significantly, but also created obligations that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. Lawford became the conduit between Hollywood and the Kennedy administration, arranging meetings and facilitating relationships that often involved beautiful actresses being introduced to the president and his brother, Robert. The most famous of these introductions connected Marilyn Monroe to both Kennedy brothers, though Lawford was implicated in arranging encounters between the Kennedys and numerous other actresses and models. Lawford's own romantic behavior was consistently irresponsible. He conducted numerous affairs during his marriage to Patricia Kennedy, showing little concern for discretion despite the political implications. His drinking and drug use escalated throughout the 1960s, with Lawford developing dependencies on alcohol and prescription medications that would plague him for the rest of his life. Friends described someone who was fundamentally weak-willed, unable to resist temptation, even when he understood the consequences of his behavior. The actor's role in Marilyn Monroe's death remains controversial. Lawford was one of the last people to speak with Monroe before she died, and some theories suggest he was asked by the Kennedys to check on her or to retrieve potentially damaging materials from her home. Whether or not these theories are accurate, Lawford's association with Monroe's final hours and his connections to the Kennedys placed him at the center of one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. Lawford's descent accelerated after his divorce from Patricia Kennedy and his falling out with Frank Sinatra, who blamed Lawford for the Kennedy administration's cooling toward the Rat Pack. Suddenly cut off from his two primary sources of status and protection, Lawford found work increasingly difficult to secure. He continued drinking and using drugs, cycling through relationships and marriages while his finances deteriorated. His later years were marked by humiliating attempts to trade on his past fame, appearing in low-budget films and television shows, giving interviews where he discussed his famous friends in ways that seemed desperate. He died in 1984 at age 61, his liver destroyed by decades of alcohol abuse. Saturnains. Chut. Harlow Jean. Harlow exploded onto the Hollywood scene with a platinum blonde sexiness that was revolutionary for its directness and lack of pretense. Her performance in films like Hell's Angels, Red Dust, and Bombshell established her as Hollywood's first true sex symbol of the sound era, a woman who radiated sexuality without apology or coyness. Behind the screen image, however, Harlow's personal life was complicated by difficult relationships, studio control, and health issues that would ultimately claim her life at just 26 years old. Harlow's sexuality on screen was revolutionary. She appeared in thin, form-fitting costumes that made clear she wore little or nothing underneath. A bold choice in the early 1930s when such things were still shocking. Her platinum blonde hair became iconic, with thousands of women attempting to replicate the look despite the harsh chemical processes required. Harlow's characters were often working-class women who used their sexuality pragmatically, acknowledging physical desire without the punishment narrative that typically befell sexually active women in films of that era. Her personal romantic history included 3 marriages, all troubled in different ways. Her second marriage to Paul Byrne, an MGM executive, ended with his apparent suicide just 2 months after the wedding, under circumstances that remain mysterious. Byrne's death was officially ruled suicide, but evidence at the scene was contradictory, and rumors suggested either that Harlow had been involved or that the studio had covered up a more complicated truth to protect their valuable star. The Byrne marriage revealed uncomfortable truths about Harlow's situation. She was essentially MGM property, with her mother serving as a stage manager who pushed Harlow toward marriages and relationships that served career purposes. The marriage to Byrne, who was significantly older and served as a mentor figure, seemed calculated to advance Harlow's position within the studio system. When Byrne died, the studio worked quickly to control the narrative, ensuring that any details emerging from the incident wouldn't damage their investment in Harlow's career. Throughout her brief career, Harlow was the subject of constant gossip and speculation. Her platinum hair, her figure-hugging costumes, her on-screen sexuality, and the scandal surrounding Byrne's death all contributed to an image of Harlow as someone living a life of wild excess. The reality was more complicated. While Harlow certainly enjoyed parties and male attention, she was also exhausted by the demands of her career and troubled by her mother's manipulation and control. Harlow's death at age 26 from kidney failure shocked Hollywood and her fans. Rumors immediately suggested alternative explanations, including speculation about botched abortions, sexually transmitted diseases, or even poisoning. But the most likely explanation is that she had suffered from kidney disease for some time, and that her mother's Christian Science beliefs delayed medical treatment until it was too late. Her brief career and early death ensured that Harlow remained frozen in time as the ultimate platinum bombshell, never having the opportunity to age, fade, or complicate her image as other stars did, becoming the template for the tragic sex symbol that would be repeated by Marilyn Monroe and others who followed in her platinum footsteps. The stories of these Golden Age celebrities reveal a Hollywood that was far more complex and troubled than the uddy, glossy images preserved in classic films. These weren't individuals who occasionally stumbled or made poor choices. They were people whose lives were characterized by compulsive behavior, boundary-pushing sexuality, and appetites that ultimately consumed them. What makes their stories particularly significant is what they reveal about the enabling systems that surrounded them. Studios employed fixers specifically to cover up scandals, publicists crafted false narratives to protect valuable properties, and the media largely cooperated in maintaining illusions that bore little resemblance to reality. This complicity meant that behavior that should have resulted in consequences instead continued unchecked, allowing patterns of excess to escalate until they became self-destructive. These celebrities lived in a world where fame and wealth insulated them from normal rules, where their value to studios meant that almost anything could be excused or covered up, and where the combination of opportunity and lack of boundaries proved toxic. Their stories serve as reminders that the past wasn't more innocent or moral than the present. It was simply better at keeping secrets. The golden age of Hollywood was golden for audiences, but deeply troubled for many of those who created that golden glow, burning themselves out to maintain illusions that ultimately couldn't be sustained. Their legacies remain complicated, forcing us to grapple with the tension between admiring their artistic contributions while acknowledging the darkness that often accompanied their creative genius.